Hey guys, tonight we're heading into a war zone, but not the loud, explosive kind you see in action movies. No, this one's quieter. Stranger. You're trudging through the cold, early morning muck of a trench during World War I. Your boots squelch in mud. The fog is thick enough to chew, and your fingers are numb even inside your gloves. You're not carrying a weapon today. Instead, you've got a small wooden crate tucked carefully under your arm. Inside it, a pigeon. One with more military clearance than you. The little bird shifts inside its box, feathers ruffling softly as if it knows it's got a mission. And maybe it does, after all. This isn't just any pigeon. This is a messenger, trained, loyal, and probably more likely to survive the day than most of the soldiers around you. You're delivering it to the front line where someone will scrawl a message, tie it to the bird's leg, and pray it finds its way home through smoke, bullets, and bombs. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, where are you listening from? And what time is it where you are? I always love seeing those sleepy check-ins. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You pause beside a dugout wall, listening to a nearby explosion echo like a distant drum. The pigeon coos once, as if unimpressed. And why would it be? Its ancestors have been doing this job for thousands of years. Julius Caesar used pigeons. Genghis Khan adored them. Even ancient Baghdad had rooftop coops for high-speed avian mail. And now, in 1916, this pigeon might save dozens of lives by doing exactly what pigeons do best. Going home. The military brass didn't trust radios yet. Wires were always getting cut, and early wireless signals were easily intercepted or jammed. But pigeons? They didn't care about interference. They weren't scared of static. They were, however, easily startled by sudden loud noises. Machine gun fire, hawks, or that one guy in your unit who smells like he hasn't bathed since 1914. In fact, one bird, named cher ami, dear friend in French, became an unlikely legend. She was a scrappy little hen assigned to the American forces during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, after two previous birds had been shot down trying to carry a desperate message. Cher ami was the last hope. She flew through thick enemy fire, was hit, blinded in one eye, and had her leg nearly shot off, but she made it. The message she carried saved nearly 200 men. The French awarded her the Croix de Guerre, and when she died, she was stuffed and put on display in the Smithsonian. You know, like all national heroes. It's hard to wrap your sleepy brain around the fact that thousands of lives were balanced on the wings of these underappreciated little beasts. And they didn't need fuel, or maintenance crews, or encryption, just a snack and a sense of direction. The trench you're standing in was one of thousands that stretched across Europe like jagged scars. Soldiers lived underground for weeks at a time, in cold, wet, disease-ridden conditions. Communication was vital, and pigeons often offered the only reliable way to get a message out. Sometimes, even the guys launching the pigeons didn't know what the messages said. Secrecy was the norm. You tied the note, whispered a quick apology for the incoming artillery, and let the bird fly. A quirky tidbit lost to most history books. There were whole divisions assigned to pigeon wrangling. Men carried custom-built pigeon backpacks, little parachutes, and collapsible lofts on their backs. Field hospitals had emergency birds. Tanks had emergency birds. Even hot air balloons had pigeons stuffed into pouches, presumably trying not to panic as the wind whooshed around them. Some militaries tried to improve on pigeons, attaching tiny cameras to their bellies to spy on enemy territory. These early aerial photographs were grainy, sometimes sideways, and occasionally included the unfortunate pigeon's feet. But they still worked. Kind of. Sort of. when the bird felt like cooperating, historians still argue whether this marked the birth of aerial surveillance or just a very weird footnote in bird photography. As you move farther down the trench, the pigeon in your arms grows still. Maybe it's sensing something, or maybe it's just asleep. You envy that. Back at camp, someone tried to explain how pigeons could find their way home from hundreds of miles away. Magnetic fields, they said. Sun positioning. Smell maps. Quantum something or other. Nobody really knows. Even now, scientists aren't sure how they do it. It's like a little mystery hiding inside a puffball of feathers and attitude. And it wasn't just Europe. Around the world, pigeons were doing war work. China, India, Egypt. The United States had over 200,000 trained birds at one point. That's a whole feathery army. You imagine the generals in some smoky war room, staring at a map littered with pigeon routes, bickering over whether a bird named Reginald could beat a telegraph in bad weather. The pigeon nips at the edge of the wooden box, and you reach down to calm it. You remember what the trainer said. Don't name it. Don't get attached. But it's hard. This one reminds you of the bird back home that used to sit on your grandmother's windowsill. You think about that a lot these days. Home, fresh bread, clean socks, no rats, and no endless, suffocating mud. A whistling sound pierces the fog. Another shell. You duck, instinctively curling around the bird's box. Dust falls. Your ears ring. But the box is intact. The pigeon is fine. So many things feel broken in this war. But not the birds. The birds keep flying. Later, you'll see it released. Its wings will slap against the wind as it arcs upward, dodging trees and clouds and smoke. You'll watch until it's a dot, and then gone. You'll never know if it makes it. You'll only hear the next day, if supplies arrive, or reinforcements, or nothing at all. But you'll hope. That's what pigeons gave soldiers back then. Not just communication, not just messages, but hope, quiet, fluttering, impossible hope. The trench fades behind you now, though its damp, earthen smell still clings to your coat. You're somewhere quieter, maybe on a rooftop, where a man in a rumpled uniform is squinting at the sky with a pair of binoculars. He's not looking for planes, he's looking for birds. Specifically, one pigeon that should have arrived 20 minutes ago. It's late, and in the world of military messaging, that's never a good sign. You lean back, watching the sky yourself. Pigeons may not be fast by modern standards, no supersonic jets or fiber optic cables here. But back then, they were the gold standard for battlefield messaging. And you're about to learn just how weirdly brilliant their bird brains are. Pigeons, it turns out, have some of the most finely tuned navigational systems in the animal kingdom. Scientists still can't agree on exactly how they do it. Some argue it's magnetoreception, an ability to sense Earth's magnetic field, like a living compass. Others say it's olfactory mapping. Pigeons create a mental map of scents carried by the wind. There are even researchers who claim they might be reading the position of the sun, adjusting their direction as the light shifts. So basically, they're flying GPS units wrapped in feathers, and they don't even charge a subscription fee. Now imagine being a general, stuck in a muddy bunker with a choice. Do you send a complicated radio message, risking it getting intercepted or garbled, or do you tie your battle plans to a pigeon's leg and hope it has a good sense of direction and no stage fright? More often than not, they picked the bird. You're looking at early 20th century technology now. Clunky field radios the size of suitcases, humming faintly, and requiring 3 sweaty men to operate. The signal's scratchy. The transmission cuts in and out. And if a single wire gets cut, silence. Meanwhile, a pigeon needs only open sky and a vague memory of breakfast. Here's the wild part. Pigeons weren't just more reliable, they were faster. In 1918, a British racing pigeon named Kaiser was clocked at an average speed of 80 kilometers per hour, over a distance of 400 kilometers. Some of the best birds could fly over 1,000 kilometers in a single day. Granted, they didn't stop to check their texts or grab a latte halfway through. Unlike humans, military engineers, desperate to improve communication, started comparing bird performance to the latest tech. The birds won repeatedly. In fact, some generals began assigning birds to back up every radio message, just in case. It was like CCing a bird on every email. But you can't just grab a pigeon from a park and expect results. These were highly trained homing pigeons, raised from chicks to recognize a single home loft. And that's where it gets complicated, because pigeons don't fly to a destination. They only return to the place they call home. So for them to be useful, you had to bring them to the battlefield already trained to fly back to base. That meant every army had to transport thousands of pigeons in cages, feed them, house them, and rotate them between active duty and rest. And when you've got pigeons that literally outperform your entire comms division, well, you build them penthouses. In Britain, there was the Royal Pigeon Service. In Germany, the Taubenabwehr. The French had entire pigeon battalions. The USS, Signal Corps, trained birds in secret bunkers. They even used pigeons to test high-altitude flight conditions before trusting parachutes. It was feathered logistics at its finest. And while we're on the subject of strange facts, pigeons were actually awarded military service numbers. Some had dog tags. A few even received official leave to mate. Yes, you heard that right. Soldiers would rotate pigeons out of service so they could go home, relax, breed a bit, and come back refreshed. Honestly, it sounds better than most human deployments. Here's a quirky little aside. In 1944, during White-Twant, the British trained a group of pigeons to recognize enemy aircraft by silhouette. The plan? Mount them in air defense observation posts and have them peck at buttons when enemy shapes appeared. This was real. It did not go well. Apparently, pigeons are judgmental, but not that judgmental. Still, birds outshined machines in many ways. They weren't hackable. They didn't need batteries. And perhaps most importantly, they were quiet. Radio chatter could give away positions. But a pigeon flapping into the sky? That was practically invisible. Historians still argue whether pigeons actually turned the tide of any major battle. Some say they were essential. Others claim their role was exaggerated by wartime propaganda and bird-loving generals. There's no doubt, though, that in specific moments, like the rescue of the lost battalion or coordinating artillery fire in isolated areas, they made a difference. And they were weirdly loyal. Most birds returned, even through storms, smoke, and shell fire. Some arrived soaked in blood. Some limped in with broken wings. But they came home. Scientists tried to study this phenomenon after the war. Universities launched pigeon psychology programs. Imagine that on your resume. They ran mazes, tested memory, even tried to teach pigeons Morse code using food rewards. Which brings us to one especially strange episode. In the 1960s, famed behaviorist B.F. Skinner conducted experiments where pigeons were trained to guide missiles. Yes, guide. Using pecking motions on a screen to keep crosshairs locked onto a target. It was called Project Pigeon. It was technically successful and immediately canceled. Apparently, trusting national defense to a bird was a bridge too far, even for Cold War America. But back in the trench-top lofts of WWI, it was perfectly normal. A soldier would write out a tiny note, sometimes no longer than a fortune cookie message, roll it into a metal capsule, gently attach it to the bird's leg, then release. The silence afterward was always strange. Soldiers would watch the bird disappear, then go back to waiting, wondering if the message would arrive or not. Today, most of those pigeon lofts are gone. The birds are silent. Their descendants coo peacefully in city parks, completely unaware that their great-great-grand pigeons were once the unsung heroes of war. But somewhere in the deep corners of military basements and pigeon racing clubs, the old records remain. Medals, journals, odd sketches of birds in harnesses, proof that there was a time when feather beat fiber optics and the quiet coo of a bird meant everything. You're still watching the sky, squinting like that tired soldier before, but now you're seeing something different. Not just pigeons flapping home, but pigeons being launched into missions even stranger, missions that whisper with espionage, with secrets sealed in darkness, and with the kind of makeshift creativity only desperate humans could invent. Welcome to the world of feathered spies. Picture it, wartime Belgium, 1941. The Nazis control nearly everything, but above the rooftops, fluttering quietly through the blue-gray dawn, something small and alive darts through the clouds. A pigeon. Its chest is strapped with a tiny cylindrical canister. Inside, microfilm. Intelligence gathered by resistance fighters. It's flying straight into occupied territory and it's not coming back. This is Operation Columba, one of the strangest spy missions in British history. Hundreds of pigeons were dropped behind enemy lines via parachute-equipped canisters. Yes, parachute-equipped pigeon pods. They floated gently down into fields, forests, and backyards. With them came instructions, written in several languages, urging civilians to record any German troop movements, signs of infrastructure, or messages they needed to send. Once written, they'd attach the message and release the pigeon. The bird would fly hundreds of kilometers back to Britain. No passport required. It sounds like a scene from a surreal Cold War cartoon. But it worked. Over 1,000 messages made it back. Some contained vital intelligence. Some were riddled with spelling errors and panic. One simply read, "The cows are eating the parachute. Please send more paper." Historians still argue whether Operation Columba had a measurable impact on the war effort. What they agree on is the courage involved, not just from the birds, but the civilians who took a huge risk writing those messages. Possession of an enemy pigeon was punishable by death in Nazi-controlled regions. Let that sink in. These birds were considered contraband. You walk now through the dusty interior of an old farmhouse attic. Light filters in through slats in the wooden roof. Stacked in the corner, a small cage, faded khaki green with British military markings. Inside, a rusted message capsule. Empty, of course, but the aura of secrets lingers. Pigeons were ideal spies precisely because they didn't look like spies. You couldn't detect them by radar. You couldn't jam their signal. They didn't drop leaflets or fire bullets. They simply arrived and left, with something precious tucked under a wing or tied to a leg. In Germany, the paranoia ran deep. The Nazis created elite anti-pigeon units, Taubenkontrollposten, whose job was to patrol rooftops, forests, and fields for suspicious birds. They monitored pigeon flight paths, confiscated civilian coops, and even trained falcons to intercept enemy birds mid-air. It was bird versus bird, nature weaponized by geopolitics. Now let's get quirkier. There's a little-known program by the French resistance involving pigeon photography. They strapped mini-cameras, tiny devices rigged to automatically snap photos at intervals, to pigeons released over enemy compounds. Most of the pictures were blurry. Some were upside down, but a few were good enough to show bunkers, tank formations, even prisoner of war camps. In one account, a pigeon captured a perfect image of a bridge under construction. A week later, Allied planes bombed it. The pigeon, presumably, got a good meal and no thank you note. This wasn't the first time pigeons had played paparazzi. Back in the early 1900s, a German apothecary named Julius Neubronner invented pigeon photography. His birds wore breast-mounted cameras with a pneumatic timer, like an old-timey GoPro, but more feathery. People laughed at the idea. Then they saw the images. Perfect, aerial shots from a bird's eye view, literally. The German military politely took interest, though they later shelved the project when cameras got bigger and pilots got less squeamish about flying with glass plates. Still, Neubronner's designs made a comeback in Wuhan. The Allies experimented again, blending the old with the new, pigeons, microfilm, and gadgets that would make James Bond jealous. Some birds were even trained to return only at night, navigating by stars as quietly as a drifting leaf. But not all pigeons were treated like comrades. In occupied territories, they were hunted, shot, trapped. In Italy, some resistance fighters smuggled pigeons inside wine barrels. In Poland, they hid them in church steeples. And in Britain, civilians were asked to look out for suspicious birds. Somewhere, a grandma with a broom became the unofficial air defense system for Kent. And yet, these birds kept flying through hail, gunfire, storms, and confusion, through territories thick with radar and riflemen, because they weren't acting out of duty or loyalty. They were just going home. There's something deeply poetic and a little absurd about that. Imagine if your entire spy network depended on creatures that might stop mid-mission to peck at a breadcrumb or flirt with a chimney. Imagine spending weeks training them, outfitting them, praying they'll ignore every distraction between point A and point B, and sometimes they didn't. One American pigeon, tasked with a crucial message in Italy, landed instead on the roof of a bakery. He was later found contentedly nibbling at a warm bread roll. The baker gave him a name and refused to return him. So much for military discipline. Still, there were triumphs. The bird named Mary of Exeter survived bombing raids, air attacks, and a hawk strike. Her beak was split, her feathers torn, her leg injured, but she returned again and again. She was awarded the Dickin Medal, the animal equivalent of the Victoria Cross. Her handler cried when she died of old age, years after the war. So much heroism, so much quiet bravery from creatures most people only think of when scraping their cars clean. It's strange, isn't it, that the same birds people call flying rats once risked their lives for nations. You step now into a museum somewhere in Belgium. The lights are soft, the air dry. You're staring at a pigeon harness behind glass, next to a faded black and white photo of a soldier grinning beside a bird on his shoulder. The caption is simple: never talked, never failed. And isn't that what all spies aim for? You're standing now in the middle of a communications tent somewhere in northern France, 1917. It hums with quiet tension, the kind that tickles the back of your neck. A corporal hunches over a table cluttered with wires, headphones, and knobs. Sparks flicker from a battered transmitter in the corner. Morse code stutters out into the ether like a nervous heartbeat. ... dash, 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 dot. But no one here fully trusts it. And there, sitting next to all this modern wizardry, a wooden pigeon crate. It's an odd pairing, the old and the new, feathers and frequencies. But that's what made this era so strange. Two communication systems, running side by side, one bleeding edge, the other ancient. Radios were loud, fragile, and temperamental. Pigeons? Quiet, stubborn, surprisingly dependable. This is the weird tug-of-war you're about to float into. Not just a war between nations, but a quiet, ongoing competition between birds and buzz. And no, the birds did not go quietly. You watch as a young technician fiddles with the antenna, trying to reach HQ. Static snarls through his headphones. A storm is moving in. Meanwhile, the pigeon handler across the room yawns, scribbles a short note, and gently slides it into a capsule. The pigeon takes off, wings flashing like soft silver blades in the sky. In this corner, we have the future. Wireless telegraphy, spark gap transmitters, the promise of instant messaging, cutting out the middle bird. In the other corner, a bird who thinks its job is to get home in time for dinner. And somehow, it still works. The military wanted so badly to believe in their radios. Who wouldn't? They were sleek, scientific. They crackled with promise, but back then, they were also incredibly fragile. Rain could ruin the signal. Metal in the ground could interfere. And then there was the human factor. One tired operator tapping out Morse code too fast could mean the difference between hold your fire and open fire. Yikes. Pigeons, on the other hand, never misspelled anything. This period of overlap, the bird and buzz era, was awkward at best. Soldiers often had both systems running in tandem. If the radio failed, they'd fall back on pigeons. If the pigeons were shot down, yes, enemy snipers sometimes aimed for birds. They'd try the radio again. Sometimes both systems failed, and someone had to run the message by foot, dodging bullets and regretting their life choices. There's a documented case from the Battle of Passchendaele where the British tried to radio for artillery support. The signal was distorted by mud-slick wiring and distant thunder. So, they launched a pigeon named Winky, yes, Winky, with the same message. She arrived in under an hour. The pigeon won. Again, still, generals were wary of relying entirely on birds. After all, there were flaws. Pigeons could be spooked, shot, or just take a nap somewhere scenic. One French commander famously refused to use pigeons after 3 of his messages arrived weeks late, attached to very smug-looking birds. But radio had its own flaws, too, especially the portable kind. They were heavy, bulky, and powered by batteries that needed constant charging. During one offensive in 1918, the batteries froze in the cold, rendering an entire radio post useless. So they huddled around their last pigeon like it was a sacred relic. Spoiler, it made it home. Historians still argue whether the eventual dominance of radio was due to its reliability or just political stubbornness. One camp claims the military pushed for wireless because it looked modern. Another believes pigeons were retired because feeding them was expensive, and no one liked cleaning up after them. Practicality versus progress, or poop. Let's talk about the weirdest part. Engineers tried to combine pigeons and tech, a sort of pigeon radio chimera. There were genuine attempts to fit birds with tiny receivers or even cameras rigged with remote triggers. None of it worked well. The birds didn't like it, the signals were weak, and the cameras mostly took excellent photos of bird fluff. But that didn't stop the ideas. In the 1930s, the Japanese military experimented with pigeons trained to land on specific color panels dropped by soldiers in distress. The idea was that downed troops could summon rescue simply by having a bird fly home with their coordinates. It kind of worked, except when the birds flew to the wrong tent or got distracted by food. Meanwhile, radio engineers tried to solve their own problems. Antennas became more mobile, receivers shrank, but encryption was still shaky. Enemy forces could intercept transmissions, and often did. In contrast, intercepting a pigeon meant catching it mid-flight, removing the capsule, reading the message, rewriting it convincingly, and releasing the bird back before anyone got suspicious. That's a lot to ask, even for wartime spies. And then there was the matter of trust. Humans trusted pigeons. There was something reassuring about watching a bird vanish into the sky. It felt solid, like mailing a letter instead of sending an email. Radios felt cold, distant, complicated. They could vanish into static at any second. Let's not forget, most of the people operating radios back then were still learning how they worked. Entire battalions had one guy who, sort of understood Morse code, and another guy who once repaired a toaster and was therefore now in charge of communications. Not exactly ideal in a crisis. Pigeons? You just fed them, released them, and hoped. The strange part is, despite all of this, both systems coexisted for nearly 3 decades. Birds flew alongside buzzing wires. Lofts were constructed next to transmitters. One general joked that he'd sooner trust a bird with his wedding vows than a radio with his battle plans. He was only half kidding. You wander now through a faded British field manual from 1915. The section on communication lists pigeons and radios with equal importance. Both methods have strengths, it says, and commanders are encouraged to prepare for the failure of one or the other. It's a rare moment of humility in a document otherwise filled with phrases like valiant dispatch and enemy engagement protocols. Even today, some special forces units in remote areas still train with pigeons, just in case. Because as long as humans keep inventing things that break, birds that fly home will always have a job. The competition between feathers and frequencies wasn't just about speed, it was about reliability, simplicity, and maybe deep down about the strange human comfort in trusting nature over machines. So next time your Wi-Fi cuts out and you hurl your phone across the room in frustration, remember, there was a time when the best alternative was a pigeon. And honestly, the pigeon probably would have done a better job. You're trudging now through a muddy French outpost in late 1917, and you've just been handed something that looks suspiciously like a spreadsheet. Except it's handwritten, in ink. And the columns aren't tracking fuel or bullets. They're tracking pigeons, names, flight durations, dietary preferences, recent performance notes. You blink slowly? Yes, that last line really does say, Alfred prefers soaked oats, not dry. Gets grumpy otherwise. Welcome to the fine, feathered world of military bureaucracy. The battlefield may be chaos, but the pigeon department? Oh, it runs like clockwork, or at least tries to. Let's start with the French. They were early adopters of military pigeonry, and they weren't messing around. By the time World War I kicked into full gear, France had over 70,000 trained pigeons on active duty. That's not a typo. They even had pigeon logistics officers, actual humans whose entire job was to coordinate pigeon transport, rotation schedules, and maintenance. Somewhere in Paris, someone with a sharp mustache was yelling at a junior officer about proper bird inventory. And the British? Well, they were no slackers either. They created the National Pigeon Service, recruiting civilian breeders across the countryside to donate their fastest, smartest birds to the cause. People sent in prize-winning racers, family pets, even that one pigeon that always stared into the kitchen window looking for crumbs. Once accepted, the birds received military serial numbers, little footbands, and official pigeon passports. Not even kidding. Your sleepy eyes scan a document labeled War Office Pigeon Protocols, Confidential. It reads like something between a training manual and a medieval bird care scroll. Birds must be rotated after every 200 kilometers of flight. They must not be overfed. They must be housed in secure lofts, ideally with minimal exposure to loud noises or strong smells. Apparently, pigeons are sensitive to perfume. Who knew? And here's the quirky twist. All these regulations weren't just fluff. They worked. Countries that properly maintained their pigeon fleets saw drastically higher message return rates. Birds that were well-fed, well-trained, and treated with respect came back. Those who were neglected or mishandled, well, they found something else to do, like living full-time in bakeries, or getting adopted by soldiers who just liked their company. Now wander with me to the German lines. The Germans had a full-on Taubenwesen, pigeon service, with detailed ranks, uniforms, and breeding records going back generations. They maintained exclusive carrier pigeon trains. actual locomotives designed to transport pigeons across the Western Front in custom compartments. These trains had climate control, food storage, and pigeon caretakers on board. Yes, they were first-class feathered passengers. Historians still argue whether Germany's meticulous pigeon system gave them a slight edge in certain campaigns. Some believe it allowed faster coordination of artillery fire, especially in areas where telegraph lines had been destroyed. Others argue it was more about the psychological comfort of having a reliable bird backup in the midst of trench confusion. Meanwhile, back in Belgium, a farmer named Gaston has rigged up a rooftop coop connected to an underground wine cellar. Inside, 6 pigeons sleep in hay nests, unaware they're part of a high-risk courier network run by the Belgian resistance. Every evening, someone sneaks in with a tiny roll of film. Every morning, the coop doors are opened. And every time, at least one bird makes it back to Allied HQ. The logistics weren't just about bird care. It was also about planning. Birds can only fly to one location, their home loft. That meant the military had to preposition birds at every forward base, outpost, bunker, and observation tower. Thousands of pigeons were raised at central locations, then carefully moved by foot, cart, or train to battlefront positions. And they had to be kept calm, if startled before release. They'd refuse to fly, or worse, fly in circles and land right back where they started. There's an actual record of a British officer writing, "Lost 3 men, lost the pigeon, got the tea." Though, priorities. Now imagine being a soldier assigned to pigeon duty. Your job is to feed, bathe, and monitor a rotating flock of birds. You're halfway between a zookeeper and a data analyst. And if one pigeon doesn't come back on time, you fill out a missing report. That's right. Military birds had MIA status. The forms were endless. Sometimes birds returned weeks later, dazed and a little thinner, with their message still attached. These were celebrated as returnees and often given medals, or at least extra corn. Back at the British Pigeon Central, yes, that was a real place. There were entire pigeon hospitals. Birds wounded in flight were treated, stitched up, and if they survived, given time to rest before being retrained. There are accounts of birds recovering from wing fractures and returning to duty months later, flying missions with scars like tiny veterans. Then there were the messengers with full retirement honors. One bird, named White Vision, helped rescue the crew of a downed aircraft during World War II. After the war, she was placed in a countryside loft and visited yearly by veterans who brought grapes and toasted her with whiskey. She declined the whiskey. She preferred seeds. You picture now a long, official table at the British War Ministry, where a very serious man in a pinstriped suit is discussing how to improve pigeon dispatch efficiency. Beside him, a chart tracking average return times. Someone suggests outfitting the birds with streamlining harnesses. Another insists on training drills. A third man quietly asks if the pigeons might prefer jazz over marching music. That man does not attend the next meeting. The bureaucracy wasn't without its absurdity. At one point, the French military tested tiny parachutes for pigeons to protect them during airdrops. The results were mixed. Some pigeons landed gracefully. Others got tangled mid-air. One landed directly in a general's soup. He was not amused. Still, the effort speaks to how seriously these birds were taken. They weren't just tools, they were teammates. Feathery, judgmental teammates who had to be fed just right, soothed gently, and never ever startled during nap time. And all of this, the tracking, training, transporting, happened while bombs fell and men died. It's surreal to think of soldiers in blood-soaked trenches, dutifully following pigeon-feeding schedules between artillery barrages. But that's war. It's chaos layered with routine. And somehow, in all that madness, someone still cared enough to write, Alfred does better with warm water. Your boots sink into the frost-bitten soil of a forward listening post, barely more than a muddy hut tucked into a hillside. Inside, 3 men speak in hushed voices, fingers numbed, eyes darting. One of them gently lifts a wooden hatch in the floor, revealing a single crate. Inside, 2 pigeons. Their eyes glitter like tiny black marbles. One preens. The other is already wearing a message tube on its leg. A coated scrap of parchment, less than an inch long, is curled inside. You're witnessing a high-stakes gamble wrapped in feathers and hope. These weren't casual notes. They weren't, "Hey, bring socks," or "We're out of tea again." These were coordinates, weather reports, emergency alerts, or confirmation of enemy movements. Messages so vital that a single delay or a missed flight could cost hundreds of lives. And so began the strange dance of encoding, encrypting, and dispatching pigeons under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Let's talk encryption first. Because, of course, if your pigeon is captured, and yes, that did happen, you don't want the enemy reading your mail. The military had entire cipher teams working on tiny codes designed to fit in the space of a fingernail. They used micro-writing, numbers as stand-ins for prearranged phrases, and even special inks that only appeared when heated. Imagine this. You have 30 seconds before the enemy is on your position. You've scribbled out a coded report of incoming artillery. You fold it tight, roll it tighter, and slip it into the narrow tube strapped to your pigeon's leg. The bird is already trembling with tension, sensing the urgency. You climb to the entrance, steady your shaking hands, and let it fly. You don't watch it go. You can't afford the luxury. You just hope that hope wasn't misplaced. In World War I, British military records showed that over 95% of pigeons successfully completed their missions, even under fire. These birds flew through explosions, storms, and sniper fire, some with wounds or clipped feathers, and still made it home. A staggering number returned with bullets embedded, wings torn, or blood on their feathers. Some were barely alive, and yet they delivered. Let's pause on one incredible case. A pigeon known as cher ami. You've probably heard the name, but picture it now. October 1918. The Lost Battalion of the U.S. 77th Division is surrounded in the Argonne Forest. Friendly fire is raining down on their position, and radio contact is gone. Desperate. They release cher ami with a note tied to her leg. We are along the road parallel 276.4. Our artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it. Cher ami is immediately shot. She falls. Somehow, against all odds, she rises again. She flies 25 miles in 25 minutes, blind in one eye, shot through the breast, with a shattered leg. She makes it to headquarters, collapses, and delivers the message. The shelling stops. The battalion survives. She is patched up, sent back to the U.S., awarded the Croix de Guerre, and buried with honors in the Smithsonian. Her tiny, broken leg, splinted with a carved silver prosthetic, still rests in the display case. It is about the size of your pinky fingernail. Historians still argue whether cher ami was actually male or female. Some records say he. Others say she. But what's certain is that this pigeon saved nearly 200 lives. Not all messages were that dramatic, but many teetered on the edge of disaster. Think about the birds flying through gas clouds. Yes, gas. During chemical attacks, some pigeons perished mid-flight from exposure to mustard gas or chlorine. Others arrived with their feathers stained green, wheezing. One handler wrote, "She landed coughing, if a bird can cough," and then sat for a full minute before allowing the note to be removed. You imagine that scene. A trembling little bird, barely alive, sitting still while a soldier kneels and whispers, "It's okay. You did it." And then there were the cold fronts. In winter, icy rain froze on wings mid-flight, and birds would plummet like stones. That's when pigeon wranglers began warming the lofts with hot coals and preheating their release crates like feathery saunas. Some soldiers took to tucking birds under their coats before release, warming them with body heat. One British sniper reportedly sewed a pigeon pocket into his tunic so the bird would stay snug before missions. The quirky detail? Pigeons hate wind from behind. No one really knows why. It disorients them. So, on windy days, messengers had to account for that, or birds would zigzag wildly off course. Some handlers claimed whistling certain tunes helped calm them before release. Others swore by feeding a few grains of poppy seed. You begin to wonder if some of these tips were superstition. Then again, when the entire mission depends on a 4-ounce bundle of muscle and fluff. You try anything. There's even a record of French soldiers writing poetic encouragements on the message scrolls, like, "Fly swift, little one, home awaits you." And some birds, remarkably, responded to familiar voices. A few handlers claimed their best pigeons wouldn't launch unless coaxed in a particular accent. We're not saying they were multilingual, but let's just say Marcel the pigeon had a soft spot for northern dialects. Let's not forget sabotage. The Germans, never ones to underestimate a feathered foe, trained falcons to intercept allied pigeons. Yes, literal bird-on-bird warfare. These trained raptors would be launched whenever enemy pigeons were spotted. Witnesses reported sky duels, feathers flying, pigeons outmaneuvering predators with sudden dives or looping curves. Some birds developed instinctual evasive patterns, curling low over rooftops or dipping under bridges. The Pigeon Counterintelligence Division, basically Fast and Furious, Bird Edition. But perhaps the strangest story is the one involving invisible ink and feathers. A British spy during Top War II developed a method for soaking pigeon feathers in a special formula that, when dried, could carry faint traces of writing visible only under ultraviolet light. That way, even if a message tube was confiscated, the actual message might still be riding, invisibly, on the pigeon itself. No one knows if it ever worked. But someone tried. You sit back now, eyes heavy, imagining the quiet grace of these bird-born missions. No engines, no wires, just instinct, direction, and an iron resolve stitched into hollow bones. These pigeons didn't choose war. They just flew. Every note they carried could have changed a battlefield, and every time one came home, someone lived. The parachute, soft, silent, often silly-looking, might be the most unappreciated invention in the history of survival. It doesn't explode, it doesn't shoot, it doesn't conquer, and yet, for thousands of soldiers, test pilots, and daredevils, the parachute was the only line between sky and grave. Let's start far before World War I, in a quiet sketchbook in Renaissance Italy. Leonardo da Vinci, ever the daydreamer, once scribbled down a design, a pyramid of cloth held aloft by wooden poles, meant to slow a fall. No one tested it, not until centuries later, but the seed was there. Control the air, cheat gravity. Fast forward to the late 18th century. A Frenchman named André-Jacques Garnerin climbs into a hot air balloon with a canvas canopy and a wild grin. He leaps. Paris gasps. His crude parachute opens like a slow-blooming flower. And he descends, twirling wildly, stomach churning, but very much alive. It's a sensation and a scientific milestone. Suddenly, parachutes aren't just drawings. They're performances. By the time World War I erupts, you'd think every pilot would have a parachute. But no. The military brass, particularly in Britain, believed parachutes would encourage cowardice. They feared pilots would abandon aircraft at the first sign of trouble. Better, they reasoned, to crash nobly than float ignobly. Let that sink in. Pride was heavier than survival. Germany, to its credit, disagreed. Their airships carried parachutes, and their pilots had them strapped in from 1915 onward. Not every chute worked. Early versions were bulky, tangled easily, or failed to deploy in time. But for the lucky few, it meant the difference between being roasted in a falling Zeppelin or landing, injured but alive, in a barn. For others, the tests continued with animals. Yes, before trusting a human life to a sack of silk, armies turned to dogs, goats, and even pigeons. In one lesser-known experiment, engineers strapped a tiny, experimental parachute to a messenger pigeon and dropped it from a watchtower. The bird flailed. The chute opened. It glided to the ground in what a witness called a noble wobble. You imagine the pigeons report. Do not recommend. Prefer wings. Dogs weren't so lucky. Photographs survive of military canines being parachuted behind enemy lines, tails tucked, ears flapping. These weren't test animals. They were trained for sabotage and communication, often landing with med kits or tiny radio parts. One British dog, named Bing, parachuted into Normandy and was later awarded a medal for bravery. He reportedly hated the parachute drill and bit his handler's boot every time he heard the packing tape crinkle. But let's get technical. A parachute works not by stopping you, but by slowing your descent to survivable speeds. It increases drag, aerodynamic resistance, by orders of magnitude. Your body falls at about 120 miles per hour in free fall. A parachute slows that to about 10 to 15. Still fast? Yes. But survivable, if deployed properly. The problem? Early parachutes were unreliable. They opened late, tangled easily, and often deployed so violently they yanked users into unconsciousness. The cords snapped, the canopies tore. There were stories, half myth, half true, of chutes opening at the last possible second, or never at all. Which brings us to test jumpers, the unsung heroes of the sky. In the 1920s and 30s, these men, and a few brave women, were paid to jump off towers, cliffs, and aircraft, wearing new designs made of silk, canvas, or bizarre rubberized fabrics. They often carried multiple chutes, one main, one backup, and sometimes a third called the pilot chute. Some survived dozens of jumps, others did not. Many early parachutes were built with vent holes, designed to prevent wild spinning. Others had weighted lines to guide the chute's fall. Some designs resembled jellyfish with rippling skirts. A few even had deployable wings, precursors to today's wingsuits. You imagine standing on the edge of a rickety test platform, wind in your ears, heart punching your ribs, staring down at the stitched fabric meant to save you. The engineer next to you smiles, clipboard in hand. Just jump. We think this one's better. Now picture that scene again. But instead of a person, it's a wooden mannequin dressed in full uniform, boots stuffed with sandbags, hands nailed to its sides. These floppy men, as soldiers called them, were dropped by the dozens to test chute integrity. Farmers sometimes found them tangled in trees and thought they were corpses. One mannequin even triggered a funeral before it was discovered to be pine and glue. By World War II, the science had matured. Paratroopers were being trained en masse, and parachute rigs had improved dramatically. Gone were the wild spins and tangled cords. Sort of. Accidents still happened. But now, jumps were strategic. Soldiers floated silently into enemy territory, dropping in under moonlight. Some carried weapons, others carried radios, maps, or explosives. The first moments after landing were often the deadliest, disoriented, scattered, and sometimes landing in enemy backyards. One account from D-Day described a soldier accidentally crashing through the roof of a French barn, landing face first in hay. He whispered, "Pardon," to a shocked cow. As parachuting became more reliable, it also became stranger. Soviet engineers pushed the limits, testing high-altitude parachute jumps that bordered on space missions. In 1960, a U.S. Air Force captain named Joseph Kittinger jumped from a balloon at 800 feet. That's 19.5 miles above Earth. The temperature was minus 94 degrees Fahrenheit. His chute opened just fine, but he blacked out halfway down, still landed safely. His jump remained a record for over 50 years. And let's not forget the automatic deployment mechanism, called a static line, which ensured that paratroopers didn't forget to pull the cord while screaming. Jump out. The line pulls, the chute opens. In theory, it wasn't perfect, but it saved lives. Oddly enough, the weight of the parachute itself was sometimes a problem. In emergencies, pilots or crewmen might need to ditch quickly, and the chute might weigh 30 pounds. That's why some airmen developed special tricks to strap the chute in only after takeoff, keeping it tucked under the seat like an invisible cushion. Yes, people sat on their parachutes, which brings us to one final, overlooked detail: parachute colors. Early chutes were drab, military gray or brown. Later, designers experimented with camouflage, blaze orange for rescue ops, and even patterned silks. One British paratrooper requested a tartan parachute. His commanding officer declined, citing excessive flare. You can smile at that, because when falling from the sky, it turns out humans still worry about fashion. Close your eyes and picture a mannequin, slouched in a canvas jumpsuit, stuffed with sawdust, its hollow wooden eyes gazing at nothing. Now imagine that same mannequin tumbling from an airplane 2,000 feet above the ground, arms flailing, legs spinning, parachute fluttering behind it like a nervous jellyfish. This is not a toy, this is science. As the 1930s and 40s ticked forward, military testing entered its most quietly absurd era, the age of the floppy men. Before anyone trusted a new parachute design with a real, breathing body, they needed something more, disposable. The solution? Life-sized crash dummies made of wood, rubber, leather, and sometimes metal joints. They were designed to mimic the weight and motion of a human falling, but they didn't always land gracefully. Farmers across rural America began reporting strange sightings. "A man fell from the sky," one wrote in a letter to the local sheriff. "He was face down in my soybean field. I thought he was dead. Turned out he was hollow." Another farmer hung the dummy on his front porch as a Halloween decoration, unaware he had just interfered with a secret military test. These mannequins had names: Sierra Sam, Oscar 8 Ball, and Vince the Vertical Dropper. Each represented a slightly different build, posture, or purpose. Some were used for parachute reliability. Others tested ejection seats, aircraft safety harnesses, or body trauma on impact. And some were used for deception. During World War II, as Allied forces prepared for the D-Day invasion, they launched an operation called Titanic, a curious, nighttime assault involving hundreds of parachuting dummies, each equipped with fake rifles, firecrackers, and small explosive devices that mimicked gunfire. The goal was confusion. German soldiers, spotting what looked like an airborne assault, rushed toward the wrong battlefield. Meanwhile, real paratroopers landed elsewhere. In some versions, the dummies were even rigged with speakers that shouted pre-recorded orders in English. "Cover the left flank, move, move!" It was surreal, ghostly warfare, an army of fake men falling from the sky, screaming into the night. But beyond trickery and testing, there were also the brave few who volunteered their actual, breakable bodies. Early test jumpers were a strange breed, half stuntman, half scientist. Many had backgrounds in circus acts, gymnastics, or barnstorming aviation. They believed in silk, and they trusted gravity. Up to a point. Tiny Broadwick, for example, was a 4'1" daredevil who became the first woman to jump from a plane using a parachute in the early 1900s. She also invented the ripcord system, now standard in most chutes. She made over 1,000 jumps in her lifetime and once landed in a lake after her parachute caught fire. When asked if she feared the sky, she replied, "Only when it's jealous." Testers like Broadwick proved that parachutes could work consistently, but that didn't mean they always did. Some jumps ended with twisted lines, tangled cords, or half-open canopies. Others ended in trees, ponds, or unexpected rooftops. A common phrase among testers was, "It's not the fall that gets you, it's the surprises on the way down." During the Cold War, testing went vertical, way vertical. Soviet scientists began launching high-altitude balloon missions with dummies aboard, studying what would happen to a body falling from the stratosphere. These mannequins would drop from 100,000 feet or more, testing heat shields, automatic chutes, and pressure suit durability. Many of these tests were classified, and when civilians stumbled across the wreckage, the results were speculative. One recovered mannequin, scorched and broken, was mistaken for an alien body by a New Mexico rancher. The legend of Roswell was born. Official explanations later revealed that the body belonged not to Martians, but to a crash test dummy dropped by Project High Dive, a U.S. Air Force parachute test in 1956. But by then, the story had already taken flight. Meanwhile, the United States was launching its own extreme parachute projects. Engineers built towers, rockets, and ejection sleds, some over a mile high, just to simulate the force of a sudden fall. The decelerator tower at Langley Field, for example, dropped mannequins straight down at terrifying speeds, only to be caught by parachutes yanked open by hydraulic arms. Sometimes the tests failed. Reports include shredded parachutes, snapped limbs on dummies, and dramatic explosions. In one memorable case, a mannequin named Test Subject 42 landed on the roof of a nearby diner. The cook screamed, thinking the Air Force had lost a pilot. For a week, newspapers debated whether it was a publicity stunt. The Air Force remained silent, but these test jumps weren't all slapstick. They laid the foundation for modern space re-entry parachutes, emergency ejection systems, and high-altitude escape pods. Without floppy men falling from alarming heights, we wouldn't have seat cushions that double as flotation devices, or astronauts landing safely in the ocean. And even in civilian life, parachutes began appearing in unexpected places. High-rise buildings in major cities experimented with emergency escape parachutes for top-floor tenants. Skiers and snowboarders began toying with parachute-assisted jumps, creating a new sport called speed riding. And in one strangely ambitious project, a man tried to parachute from a drone. He succeeded, briefly, then sued the manufacturer. Modern parachute testers now use advanced crash dummies, rigged with sensors, accelerometers, and pressure plates. They cost thousands of dollars each, and can simulate everything from bone fractures to internal bleeding. But even these ultra-realistic mannequins sometimes fall overboard. One washed ashore in Florida and was declared likely a homicide until authorities noticed the barcode on its spine. Today, the parachute is safer than ever. Base jumpers leap from cliffs with confidence, skydivers perform aerial ballets, military paratroopers descend in tight formations, guided by GPS. But every single jump, every gentle landing, owes its success to a long, strange lineage of floppy men, brave women, and curious engineers. And somewhere, in a quiet storage room in a military museum, a headless mannequin rests inside a dusty parachute harness, its name forgotten, its mission complete. It never spoke a word, but it changed the sky, You're floating now, gently, silently, drifting through the upper atmosphere in a large, translucent sphere. The clouds curl beneath you like foamed milk, and the earth below is so distant it looks soft. Your hands tremble, not from fear, but from anticipation. Somewhere down there is your target. Or rather, your message. Because tonight, you're not just drifting for pleasure. You're part of a balloon campaign. A slow, quiet war fought with gas, paper, and patience. The quiet war of pigeons and parachutes wasn't fought solely with feathers and silk. No. Some of the strangest aerial strategies involved balloons, huge, unwieldy, and shockingly effective. During times of conflict and propaganda, the humble balloon was repurposed into a strategic tool of psychological warfare. Let's start with the basics. A helium-filled balloon doesn't look like much. It's clumsy, unpredictable, subject to wind currents and weather, but it's cheap and disposable. And most importantly, balloons float across borders without asking for permission. During the Cold War, Western forces began experimenting with balloon propaganda drops. Instead of bombs or paratroopers, they launched millions of leaflets, pamphlets, newspapers, and even religious texts, each attached to a small balloon or weighted paper parachute. It was called Operation Prospero, Operation Little Switch, Operation Skyward. They had many names, but all had the same goal: reach the hearts and minds of those behind the Iron Curtain. You're probably imagining some goofy clown balloon party in the sky. But this was serious business. Over 300,000 balloons were launched by Western European organizations in the 1950s alone, carrying messages in multiple languages: Czech, Polish, Hungarian, Russian, carefully translated and subtly worded to avoid sounding too aggressive. The idea wasn't to scream, but to whisper. One American agency even employed psychologists to draft the leaflets. They'd spend hours debating which phrases felt liberating versus inciting. It was like running a marketing firm aimed at oppressed people, aerial advertising, with political stakes. Sometimes, the messages weren't just words. Balloons dropped vinyl records, miniature radios, and once, a single foldable bicycle with a note that read, "Ride to Freedom." Did it work? Well, historians still argue whether balloon campaigns had any actual impact on morale. Some believe the balloons were mostly intercepted, confiscated by authorities before civilians could even see them. Others claim they sparked curiosity, especially among rural populations who viewed the floating materials as sky gifts. It's hard to measure hope, but what's absolutely true is that balloons caused a lot of confusion. The Soviets weren't sure how to stop them. Anti-aircraft guns couldn't hit the flimsy, drifting things. Radar stations couldn't track them accurately, and the sheer volume of balloons made it feel like an invasion of ghosts. Some towns even believed they were part of a biological attack, and quarantined entire neighborhoods where leaflets landed. In East Germany, a shepherd once found a pile of pamphlets tangled in his trees and tried to burn them in a panic. The fire spread. His barn went up in flames. He was fined for destruction of evidence, even though the wind had done most of the work. But it wasn't just the West floating ideas across borders. North Korea, China, and later, Cuba developed their own balloon propaganda strategies. In the 1960s, South Korea was bombarded with floating boxes that contained crude anti-capitalist cartoons and, for some reason, thousands of tiny paper frogs. Let's pause here. Paper frogs, folded, carefully, one by one, packed into a balloon, released into the night. That's dedication. Back in the US, balloon launches became a form of amateur activism. College students and church groups would organize leaflet drops on weekends, turning propaganda into a kind of bizarre hobby. They'd gather at dawn in open fields, inflate massive weather balloons, attach messages of peace and liberty, then let them go. Sometimes the wind would carry them right back into their own town. Other times, they'd disappear over the Atlantic. A group in Denmark even launched balloons filled with chocolate bars, hoping that a sugar shortage in Eastern Europe might make their message tastier. It's unclear if the chocolate ever made it, or if it simply melted mid-air and terrified a few birds. Of course, not all balloon projects were innocent. During World War II, Japan launched over 9,000 balloon bombs, designed to ride the Pacific jet stream and explode upon impact in the United States. They were made of rice paper, hydrogen, and simple incendiary payloads. Most fell harmlessly in forests or fields. But tragically, one balloon bomb killed 6 people in Oregon, the only W-2 fatalities on U.S. soil caused by enemy action. In response, the U.S. media was ordered into silence to avoid public panic. It worked a little too well. When Japanese officials heard nothing about the bombs, they assumed the project had failed and canceled further launches. Ironically, because of how quietly the American public took the hit. So much for noise. Meanwhile, in modern times, North and South Korea continue their balloon battles. Activist groups launch anti-regime messages across the border, sometimes carrying USB drives with K-pop videos or snippets from banned films. In return, the North sends balloons back, filled with their own pamphlets, and occasionally, rather unpleasant substances. Yep, sometimes it's not chocolate. The United Nations has repeatedly urged both sides to stop the balloon provocations, calling them dangerous. But the sky remains a tempting battlefield, open, invisible, and just out of reach. Back in the 1950s, a balloon floated over Czechoslovakia carrying a simple postcard. It read, "We believe in your right to read." A farmer found it stuck in his fence. He didn't tell anyone. He folded it gently and kept it in a wooden box, next to his family Bible. After the revolution, decades later, he donated the card to a museum. That balloon didn't win a war, but it might have warmed one very cold heart. And that's the curious thing about aerial whispers. You never really know who hears them, or how far they fly. You're blinking now, slowly, deliberately, as twilight sinks in and the room around you darkens, just like the sky over Normandy in 1944. Imagine you're sitting in the back of a glider, knees tucked in, surrounded by parachutes, pigeons, and something that looks suspiciously like a typewriter strapped into a seatbelt. Because tonight, you're going to war without an engine. Welcome to the shadowy world of military gliders, the silent ghosts of the sky, designed to deliver troops, equipment, and the occasional bird, all without a single hum of a motor. Now, you may think, wait, gliders? Like the ones kids fly off hills? Not quite. These were massive, winged coffins made of plywood and canvas, towed by bombers, and then cut loose mid-air to silently coast down behind enemy lines. You're not in a cockpit. You're in a box that's about to fall. World War II saw the bizarre rise of glider warfare, an attempt to insert troops stealthily into hostile territory. Planes were too loud and parachutes too scattered. Gliders, on the other hand, could carry entire squads of soldiers, jeeps, anti-tank guns, and, yes, pigeon cages, because someone had to carry the comms. The British used the Horsa glider, big and clunky but surprisingly strong. Americans used the Waco CG-4A, a fragile little number lovingly nicknamed the Hadrian. It had a nose that could hinge upward, like a hungry alligator, to disgorge its cargo the second it touched ground. Now, imagine you're inside one. The glider's being towed behind a C-47. You're 100 feet up. The line detaches. Suddenly, it's silent. No engines. Just the eerie whistle of air and the creaking of stressed wooden ribs. The glider dips, banks slightly, Your pilot, barely trained, is aiming for a dark field somewhere in Nazi-held France. You really hope that's not a lake. Your landing options? Limited. Most gliders had no brakes, no second chances, and no landing gear worth mentioning. It's a one-time deal. You crash, unload, fight. They called it silent death from above. And for good reason. Glider troops were sitting ducks during descent, and soft targets on the ground. But they were also shock troops, dropped directly into strategic zones. Bridges, roads, anti-air emplacements. And the pigeons? They were packed right beside you. Glider troops were expected to carry carrier pigeons for emergency communications. Radios were unreliable, especially in remote enemy terrain. So if your team was cut off, you'd open a tiny wooden door, unroll a small paper message, and let your bird fly for friendly lines. Some birds never made it. Others saved lives. There's a documented case of a glider group that crash-landed behind enemy lines and was surrounded by German troops. They released a pigeon named Tommy, who flew back to Allied HQ with a scribbled note. Surrounded, need air support. Coordinates below. Less than an hour later, British fighters swooped in. Tommy was awarded a medal. Now, historians still argue whether glider assaults were worth the heavy casualties. The concept was bold but brutal. Crash-landing hundreds of men in untested wooden crafts was never going to be elegant. But sometimes, that messiness was the very thing that caught enemies off guard. There's something raw about a glider attack. It's like whispering into a hurricane and hoping your voice gets through. But gliders weren't just used in France. The Allies used them in Sicily, in Burma, even in the dense forests of Holland. The Operation Market Garden disaster was a massive glider operation gone wrong. Dozens of craft crashed into trees, canals, or enemy fire. One glider, aiming for a pasture, landed nose first in a barn. The sheep inside lived. The glider crew didn't. It wasn't always grim, though. A lesser-known story involves a glider that crash-landed in Normandy next to a chicken coop. Amid the chaos, a trooper picked up a stunned hen and tucked it into his backpack, naming it General Cluck. The hen survived the entire war and was later given a tiny helmet made of a tea strainer. Strangely, some of the biggest experiments in glider warfare weren't American or British at all. The Soviets developed an enormous glider called the Antonov A-40, meant to carry an entire light tank. Yep, a tank with wings. Did it work? Well, once. They tried it in 1942. A biplane towed the tank glider into the air, struggled horribly, released it prematurely. The tank glided briefly, crash-landed in a field, and miraculously, the crew drove it away with only minor damage. Historians still argue whether this counts as success or just a very stylish accident. Even stranger? The Japanese developed kamikaze gliders, piloted craft filled with explosives, one-way tickets to the great beyond. Pilots were expected to steer their glider into enemy ships. The idea never really caught on, mostly because it was horrifying and ineffective. But not all gliders were military. In the post-war years, glider clubs exploded in popularity. Veterans who had trained in wartime gliders took up soaring as a peaceful hobby. They built elegant, efficient, motorless aircraft and spent their weekends riding thermals instead of dodging bullets. It's one of those strange twists, a tool of war transformed into a leisure sport. Today, you can still find rusted glider frames in European forests. Some have trees growing through their hulls. Others have been converted into birdhouses. Ironically, a place once used to carry pigeons now hosts them. That's the thing about gliders. They vanish. No engine, no roar, no trace. Just a soft swoosh of air, a hush, a landing, and maybe, if you're lucky, a chicken named General Cluck waiting to greet you. The crash is sudden, the silence broken by splintering wood and crunching earth. You jolt forward in your harness, legs tingling, heartbeat thudding like a snare drum, and just like that, You're on the ground. Welcome to the strange aftermath of a glider landing. But let's pivot now. You've landed. Yes. But how do you know what's next? Where to go? Who's alive? Where the nearest danger lies? That's where the quiet war picks up again. Not in the skies or the trenches, but in the uncertain trickle of battlefield information. Enter Pigeons and Parachutes. Round 2. After the drop, silence becomes your greatest enemy. Radios are spotty, batteries freeze, operators get lost. But there's something else. Something fluttering and cooing inside a small wooden crate on your hip. You undo the latch. You unfurl a message. You attach it to the pigeon's leg with a clip that feels impossibly delicate in your shaking fingers. Then you lift it, and whoosh, up it goes, vanishing into the gray dawn. These birds had no GPS. No walkie-talkies, just magnetoreception, sun angle reading, and some strange, ancient sense of home. Scientists still don't fully understand how pigeons navigate over hundreds of miles with such precision. One theory involves low-frequency infrasound, subtle vibrations in the earth. But historians and biologists both admit the mystery's not fully solved. And the battlefield depended on this mystery. That pigeon might be your only line back to headquarters. No barbed wire, no language barrier, no bullet-stopping helmet, just wings and instinct. There's something sobering about that, isn't there? That with all the artillery and tanks and brutal modern weapons, the fate of dozens of men could hang on the flight path of a single feathered friend. Of course, sometimes the message didn't arrive. Sometimes the bird was shot, or got lost, or landed politely in the camp of the opposing army. Which brings us to one of the oddest twists in this airborne saga: pigeon espionage. The Germans knew what the Allies were up to, and the Allies knew the Germans were onto them. So the battlefield began to fill with decoy pigeons, interception squads, and, yes, anti-pigeon falcons. No, you're not dreaming. In 1942, the Germans trained falcons to hunt enemy pigeons. These birds of prey were stationed along suspected pigeon flight routes, tasked with intercepting and killing Allied messenger birds in mid-air, somewhere over Belgium. A pigeon named Gustav was probably locked in a life-or-death chase with a falcon named Hans. Historians still argue whether this airborne combat ever had meaningful results. There are reports, half legend, half believed, of captured pigeons being kept in cages, interrogated with crackers and cooing, then released with false messages to mislead the enemy. Think of it as psychological warfare, but with feathers. On the other side, Allied forces trained soldiers in pigeon recognition. Sounds fake, right? But it's true. You had to know your side's birds. They came marked with colored rings, tiny insignias, or special tattoos on their feet. Losing a bird meant more than just a broken message. It meant a hole in your unit's brain. And of course, pigeons parachuted, too. Remember those little canisters we talked about? Some birds were released with small parachutes of their own, especially those in dangerous territory. The pigeon would float gently to the ground in its case, then be released by an awaiting soldier who'd carry it into enemy land like a living telegram. There are even stories, blurred at the edges, of pigeons being used to drop propaganda leaflets. One moment you're eating rations behind a barn, the next a bird swoops down and drops a note that says, "Lay down your weapons. Fritz." Not exactly subtle, but strange times call for strange ideas. Meanwhile, back in Britain, the National Pigeon Service was growing. Volunteers raised birds in their backyards, donating them to the military. Some were sent out by submarine. Others rode in tanks. And when soldiers dropped behind enemy lines, pigeons dropped with them, sometimes more reliably than their radios. The UK even had pigeon medics. Well, sort of. The birds that survived were brought back, cleaned, examined, and gently housed until their next mission. If they were injured, clipped wings, broken legs, They were treated in miniature vet clinics, built just for avian heroes. Tiny splints, warm towels, even a soothing radio playing classical music in the background, because apparently, Mozart calms traumatized pigeons. You can't make this up, but all wasn't feathers and fluff. Many pigeons were lost, some during storms, some due to enemy action, others from sheer exhaustion. Flying 500 miles over open sea, dodging hawks and gunfire, carrying messages weighing more than their own body mass. It's a miracle they worked at all, and yet they did. There's one story from the D-Day invasion that still gives military historians goosebumps. A pigeon named William of Orange flew over 250 miles from Holland to England in a single day, through fog, sleet, and shellfire. He brought back critical intelligence that helped prevent a planned ambush on British troops. He was awarded the Dickon Medal, which is basically the animal version of the Victoria Cross. But here's the part that really sticks with you. That little bird, exhausted and rain-soaked, was found standing outside his coop, barely breathing, still gripping the message tube in his claw. Let that image settle. A trembling bird, a damp sky, a war waiting to move forward, all because of one small survivor who didn't give up. The gliders were down, the troops were scattered, the radios fizzled, but the pigeons still flew, still delivered, still carried whispers across a continent lit with fire. And even now, deep inside a military museum somewhere, that tiny tube, the one clenched in William's claw, is on display. It's empty now, but it once held the future. So there you are again, boots sunk ankle-deep in some muddied French field, a crumpled map in your hand, the soft coo of pigeons fading behind you. You've landed, survived, and sent out your feathery SOS. But now, it's all about waiting. And in war, waiting can be the most dangerous game of all. But you're not alone in the quiet. Overhead, drifting on invisible currents, another kind of parachute is descending. It's small, really small, too small to carry a person. Too small even for most gear, but large enough, just barely, to carry something far more valuable. Information. As the war dragged on and communication technology evolved, a new breed of secret courier was born. Not feathered, not breathing, but silent, light, and largely overlooked. Parachute canisters for maps, code books, photographs, and in some cases, raw intelligence. These weren't the heavy supply crates that slammed into hedgerows. These were the whisper-quiet parachutes tucked inside covert ops, a parachute the size of your jacket, carrying a load no heavier than your lunchbox. They fell like dandelion seeds, delicate and deliberate. And often, they came with no one to greet them, because this wasn't always about armies. Sometimes it was about spies, MI6 and the OSS. The predecessors of today's intelligence services started using these little parachutes to drop intel behind enemy lines. Maps printed in waterproof ink, messages written in lemon juice, pens that doubled as radios, cigarette packs containing microfilm. The gear was hidden inside inconspicuous containers, like biscuit tins or hollowed-out books, gently lowered from planes in the dead of night. And waiting below, a single agent, maybe a schoolteacher by day, or a priest, or a milkman, someone who'd volunteered or been coerced to risk their life for whispers and shadows. They'd sprint to the drop site, often alone, guided by nothing more than coordinates scrawled on a sugar packet and the sound of fabric rustling in the wind. Retrieve the package, hide it, decode it, and wait. These parachute drops weren't always clean. Historians still argue whether Operation Sussex, a campaign to infiltrate and observe Nazi troop movements, was one of the most successful or most error-ridden intelligence ops of the war. Dozens of small parachutes were lost. Some floated off course. Some were picked up by German farmers. At least one, legend claims, was snagged by a suspicious goat, who chewed up an entire message before it could be read. Goats, unsung agents of counterintelligence. But some of these packages reached their targets, and what they contained could shift entire invasions. One such drop included detailed maps of Normandy, complete with pencil-sketched German defenses. These weren't produced by satellites or drones. They came from brave agents on bicycles, sketching gun placements from behind hedgerows, then hiding the drawings in false-bottomed jam jars. These were passed to resistance networks, eventually making their way back across the channel via, you guessed it, mini parachutes. And then there were the photos. Small, grainy, black and white images that looked like school portraits, until you realized they were aerial shots of V-2 rocket launch sites or secret bunkers camouflaged as barns. These tiny parachutes weren't glamorous, but they were crucial. Silent threads connecting spy to soldier, plane to ground. One man's scribbled warning to another's plan of attack. Occasionally, pigeons and parachutes would even collaborate. A pigeon would carry a message detailing where and when to drop a parachute load. The load would contain a reply, or more pigeons. That's right, pigeons, dropped by parachute, who then flew back with intel. If that makes your brain hurt a little, you're not alone. The sheer choreography required to pull this off feels more like a ballet than a battle plan. But it happened. Not often. Not without chaos. But sometimes, just sometimes, it worked. The people behind these operations were as strange as their tools. There's the case of Agent Fifi, a female British spy who used mini parachute drops to distribute fake orders designed to confuse German supply lines. She wore a perfume so distinct, it was catalogued in Allied reports, part of her scent-based psychological warfare tactic. Whether it worked is still up for debate, but the Germans reportedly searched more perfume shops than radio towers in some occupied towns. Or the baker's ghost, a nameless agent in the French resistance who received a drop full of British cigarettes and maps, only to disappear entirely for weeks. When he returned, he had a limp, a foreign accent, and blueprints of a German rail station. To this day, no one's quite sure what happened in those missing weeks. Some say he was captured and escaped. Others think he was replaced entirely. The name stuck because he always left flower footprints where he'd been. And behind it all were the makers of the parachutes themselves. Women working in wartime factories, sewing silk and cotton by hand, attaching cords and rings and carefully folding payloads they'd never see deployed. They didn't know where the drops would land, just that they might change everything. Some added small, unsanctioned notes. Stay safe. Love from Liverpool. You've got this, sweetheart. Kick Hitler where it hurts. And sometimes, if a package was recovered safely, a soldier or spy would send a pigeon back, not with military intel, but with a handwritten thank you. Just a little note. No war secrets, just human ones. And speaking of human moments, here's a strange little fringe tidbit that probably won't show up in your average textbook. A Canadian spy once requested that a supply drop include only chocolate, nylons, and a harmonica. No weapons, no maps, just creature comforts. Morale is the best intel, he wrote. Historians still argue whether his request was genius or absurd, but it was granted. Sometimes, even in the quiet war, strange requests got through, and as you crouch now behind a ruined wall, watching a parachute twist in the low wind, you realize something. This war wasn't only fought with guns and tanks and loud things, it was also fought with silence, with whispers on silk cords, with birds and biscuits and clever lies. The battle is still raging, sure, but for now, in this quiet moment, you're part of the strangest supply chain in history, and you're waiting for the next package to fall. Drift with me now. Not into trenches, but into fluorescent-lit labs and windowless university basements, where the war has long since ended. But a quiet rivalry continues. Pigeons versus machines. It sounds like a bad sci-fi parody, doesn't it? But it's true. Decades after the last war pigeon hung up its wings, metaphorically, scientists still hadn't let go of one burning question. Why were pigeons so good at this? At navigating, at recognizing, at surviving, at delivering, no matter what. The result? A series of strange, forgotten experiments starting in the 1970s and stretching well into the 21st century. Experiments that pitted pigeons, not just against their evolutionary instincts, but against our smartest technology. The most famous of these came from a lab in Minneapolis, where researchers at the University of Minnesota built tiny pigeon classrooms. No joke. There were little touchscreen monitors, treat dispensers, and pigeons standing on soft pads, pecking their way through image recognition tasks. The goal? Train pigeons to distinguish between different categories of visual information, medical slides, artworks, even street scenes. What happened next baffled everyone. The pigeons passed, not barely, not randomly, consistently. They could distinguish healthy from cancerous cells in microscope images with up to 85% accuracy. That's a number that, at the time, rivaled early image recognition algorithms. They also did well at distinguishing different styles of painting, identifying whether a canvas was painted by Monet or Picasso or a child with finger paints. And once taught, they could generalize, apply their learning to new examples they hadn't seen before. This stunned researchers. Machines often struggle with generalization, but pigeons, they just pecked with quiet confidence. What made this even more haunting was that pigeons weren't being shown a logical system. They didn't understand what cancer looked like or what cubism meant. They couldn't explain it. But somehow, they could see it, and they weren't alone. Crows, parrots, and magpies were also put to the test, but pigeons held their ground. Even when machine learning improved and neural nets became faster, pigeons kept pace in certain tasks, especially those involving real-world navigation and cluttered imagery. In 2016, a group of AI researchers jokingly proposed an idea. Benchmark AI against birds. If it can't beat the bird, it's not ready for the battlefield. And though no one built a formal test, yet the sentiment lingers. In the race to perfect drone recognition systems, researchers still reference bird brains. Why? Because despite their size, avian brains have evolved dense neural clusters dedicated to spatial memory, orientation, and visual pattern matching. Put simply, pigeons are tiny, feathery computers, only they're older, organic, and weirdly patient. There's even a term for this branch of study, biomimetic cognition. That's a fancy way of saying, what if we stop reinventing the wheel and just copy the pigeon? You might laugh, but DARPA didn't. Neither did Google. Both have quietly studied avian navigation, hoping to one day integrate aspects of it into drone autopilot systems. One experiment tried to teach drones to make decisions the way a pigeon would, using landmark triangulation instead of just GPS. Another tried to mimic the saccadic scanning pattern of pigeon vision, the rapid, jerky micro-movements birds make when observing a scene, which, oddly enough, helps them build a 3D map of their surroundings faster than most LiDAR systems. Still, no machine has fully replicated it. In maze trials, pigeons still find food more efficiently than autonomous robots. In open-world clutter scenarios, pigeons still navigate better than miniature drones. And in pattern recall, recognizing distorted or degraded images, pigeons sometimes outperform even the most expensive vision AI models. It's become something of an unspoken benchmark in research circles. Can it beat the pigeon? If not, back to the drawing board. Of course, pigeons don't know they're in competition. They just do what pigeons have always done: fly, remember, and come home. But maybe that's the point. Maybe the real intelligence isn't flashy, isn't loud, isn't artificial. Maybe it's quiet, persistent, feathered, and maybe that's why they keep showing up. On rooftops, in labs, even in the corners of military history. You'd think they'd have retired by now. But no, somewhere out there, a pigeon is still doing its job, better than $1 million robot. And it doesn't even ask for charging cables. You don't hear it at first. But high above, beyond the clouds and contrails, the faint whine of something mechanical hums through the air. Not feathers now, carbon fiber. Not instinct, but algorithm. You're not watching pigeons anymore. You're watching drones. Today's quiet warriors in a new kind of sky war. After centuries of training birds to fly messages, spy on enemies, and outmaneuver storms, humans decided to build their own version. And naturally, they copied the only design that ever really worked. Light, fast, silent, and smart. The pigeon blueprint, modernized into autonomous flying machines. It started simply enough. Early military drones in the 1990s were big, clunky things with propellers and terrible control systems. They had all the grace of a falling toaster. Most were remote-controlled by teams in trailers, often crashing if the signal cut out. But technology, like Pigeons, adapts. Soon, GPS and gyroscopes shrank. Cameras improved, and AI began to move into the cockpit, or rather, the chip. Now drones didn't just fly, they could see. And that's when things started to feel familiar. Because suddenly, military planners were talking about recon missions, autonomous message relays, even target identification in cluttered environments. Sound familiar? It's the pigeon job description, just rewritten in code. Modern drones operate in much the same spirit as those birds who once fluttered over muddy trenches. Only now, instead of grain rewards, they run on lithium batteries. And instead of feathers, their wings are forged from carbon lattice. Silent and strong, you have drones that scan earthquake zones for survivors, drones that zip through forests, mapping fire damage, drones that hover outside windows, listening, watching, and, in some of the eeriest throwbacks, drones that deliver messages, supplies, even sensitive documents across battlefields or over city borders, just like a war pigeon might have done in 1917, only without the risk of being shot down by a hawk. But here's the twist. Even with all this progress, drone developers still look backward, still borrow from birds, especially pigeons. Some aerial robots mimic how birds fold their wings during turbulence. Others track avian aerodynamics to improve energy efficiency during glides. One famous model, the Perdix drone, was actually designed to swarm like a flock of birds. Release 1, and it's useful. Release 50, and they communicate mid-air, rearranging formation, avoiding collisions, and adjusting course without a central command. Just like pigeons, remember? Those chaotic flocks that somehow knew how to fly together without a leader. It's now a DARPA project. Of course, there's something unsettling about this, because while birds were loyal, often even sweet in their devotion, drones are, well, let's say they don't coo affectionately. Some carry cameras, some carry weapons, and some carry nothing at all but code. Silent watchers programmed to relay what they see to someone far away. Someone who never has to set foot on a battlefield. The military calls them force multipliers. But deep down, they're still just messengers, zipping above like digital birds. And just like pigeons, they're surprisingly hard to stop. In fact, in one strange 2018 trial, a team of engineers tested drone stealth capabilities against radar, infrared sensors, and even trained hawks. Guess who dodged everything? The drone. No feathers to heat up, no heartbeat to track, no scent to smell, just a blinking LED and a whisper of wind. But here's the catch. While drones are fast and efficient, they lack soul. There's no loyalty, no homeward instinct. If their code fails, they fall. You can't whisper to a drone. You can't mourn it the way you did a brave little bird who died with a message still clutched to its chest. Historians still argue whether machines will ever truly replace animals in the most sensitive tasks. Things like rescue, recognition, or morale. Because here's the truth. When soldiers in the field saw a pigeon arrive, it meant something. Hope, contact, a tiny reminder that they weren't forgotten. Drones are faster, yes, but they're cold. And oddly, in some parts of the world, pigeons are still used, even now, even in the 2020s, because they can't be hacked, can't be jammed, and they always come home. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? With all our intelligence and all our progress, we still haven't built a machine quite as reliable, or as quietly heroic, as the humble pigeon. Still, the skies belong to both now. One is ancient and feathered, the other is forged and coded. But they share a legacy, to deliver, to endure, to vanish into the clouds and come back changed. And as you watch that tiny speck in the sky, be it beak or blinking light, you can't help but feel it. The silent echo of a long, strange war, still playing out in quiet glides and distant coasts. Not quite over, not quite forgotten. Somewhere in a dusty military archive, beneath rows of yellowed folders and forgotten blueprints, there lies a strange little document. It's not grand, no secret weapon, no revolutionary code, just a small flight log, carefully typed, detailing the last known official military pigeon mission. Dated 1957. You trace the fading ink with your finger, and for a moment, it feels like touching the edge of a curtain being drawn closed. The age of the pigeons quietly ended, not with an explosion or a ceremony, but with a final flutter. One last dispatch through the skies. The bird? Her name was Kaiser, trained in Germany, deployed during Cold War drills. Her job wasn't dramatic, just relaying routine updates across an isolated military post where radio signals kept dropping. She completed her mission. Then she simply retired. No medals, no headlines, just a return to her coop, a few final seeds, and a life of peaceful preening. And that, oddly enough, was the fate of thousands like her. The last generation of messenger pigeons didn't crash in battle. They didn't explode mid-flight. They weren't phased out violently. They just became obsolete, slowly, quietly. And isn't that fitting? For all their wartime bravery and strategic brilliance, pigeons were never about grandstanding. They didn't bark orders or wear polished boots. They weren't celebrated in victory parades or featured in newsreels. They were silent helpers, unsung couriers, background heroes. And so, as technology crept forward, radio, satellite, internet, the birds slipped back into the margins. Some were rehomed by breeders. Some found peace in countryside lofts. Some, tragically, ended up abandoned when governments shuttered their last coops. Historians still argue whether the pigeons could have had a broader peacetime role, maybe in environmental monitoring or rural medicine delivery. But their story mostly fluttered to a close. Except not entirely, because today, in odd corners of the world, you'll still find pigeon keepers. Quiet old men with tiny notepads, recording wing patterns. Young girls training birds to race for fun, not for war. Tiny rooftop lofts nestled in cities where no one looks up anymore. And once in a while, a pigeon arrives unexpectedly, tagged, tired, but home. From where? No one quite knows, because despite everything, urban sprawl, satellites, GPS, digital clouds, pigeons still fly, still remember, and still return. There's something gently defiant about that, as if nature, despite all our inventions, refuses to fully hand over the reins. And here's where you pause, eyes heavy, head nestled against your pillow. You think of how many things must have been carried across the sky by birds. Hope, desperation, orders that saved lives, or ended them. A quiet war, fought in shadows and thermals, without fanfare, without credit. It wasn't about glory, it was about getting the job done. And in a world that constantly races forward, chasing noise and novelty, maybe there's something deeply restful about that. No sensors, no circuits, Just instinct, feathers, and trust. The last pigeon may have flown, but the wind still remembers the shape of their wings. And sometimes, if you're very still, and the city noise softens, you can almost hear it. The distant flutter of a message in motion. The quiet grace of a bird returning home. Wind down, 300 words. So now, you let your breathing slow. Feel the rhythm settle. Like wings gliding on a current that needs no effort, no push, just presence. The skies are quiet now. No bombs, no signals, no coded threats in tiny canisters. Just stars, a breeze, and perhaps the softest coo from a bird that no longer needs to carry anything at all. You imagine that last coop door swinging open, the bird taking flight not because she must, but because it's who she is. A quiet motion, forward, upward into fading light. The kind of light that hovers just before sleep claims you fully. Let it. There's nothing more to carry tonight. The missions are done. The parchments delivered. The war, such as it was, has drifted into memory, stored in dusty files and fluttering feathers pressed between pages of forgotten books. Now all that's left is stillness. Let the silence settle behind your eyes. Let your mind nest like a bird in soft hay. No need to run messages, no need to decode meaning, only to breathe and rest and dream. You are safe, you are home, and far above you. Somewhere between then and now, 1,000 little wings have folded closed for the last time.